I'm Dave Gervich, and I'm here to talk about the Holocaust. Sue and I moved here in the spring of 1972, and she passed away in March of 2019. During the majority of the years that we raised our family here, we were the only Jewish family in Iowa Falls, if not the county. I used to tell Sue that since I was the only guy in town who had been bar mitzvahed, that gave me the privilege of unilaterally declaring myself as the rabbi for all the Jews in Iowa Falls. You know what Sue's answer to that was? You want to be the rabbi? Fine. Now go take out the trash. Heinrich Bender, born October 11th, 1866, in Munster, Mayfield, Germany, died Holocaust. His wife, Emma Hertz Bender, date of birth not given, born in Polch, died Holocaust. Their daughter, Irene, born January 1912 in Munster, died Holocaust. Her two boys, the names aren't given, one was born in 1939, both died Holocaust. Adolf Bender, born February 2nd, 1889 in Munster, died Holocaust. His wife Lottie died Holocaust. Their daughter Edith died Holocaust. Joseph Forst, born August 1st, 1896 in Lotz, died Holocaust. His wife, Betty Bender Forst, born February 8, 1896 in Munster, died Holocaust. Their daughter Wilma, born January 1932, died Holocaust. Carl Bender, born July 16, 1901 in Munster, died Holocaust on March 9, 1941 in Berlin. His wife, Alice Egner Bender, date of birth not given, died Holocaust. Their daughter Wilma died Holocaust. This notebook, from which I read 17 names, is my late wife Sue's family tree on her mother's side. It was compiled about 35 years ago by a cousin of Sue's, Leo Honig. Sue and Leo had many phone conversations when Leo was working on this, because at the same time, Sue was also investigating the family history. And when Leo found out about that, he started calling Sue. Many of those phone conversations lasted 2.5 hours. It would be 9 or 9:30 at night, and Sue would be sitting across from me on the phone with Leo, going like this at me, because she couldn't shut him up. But she always took his calls and talked as long as he wanted to visit, and they formed a bond. They realized that they both had a burning interest in the family history, the family members, who they were, where they came from, and what happened to them. You probably noticed as I read the names that most of them came from Munster, Germany, and most of the last names were Bender, B-E-N-D-E-R. Carol Bender was Sue's grandmother, so those names were Sue's great aunts and uncles and cousins. Something else you may have picked up on as I went through the names was that in most cases I was able to read something, it wasn't always complete, but something about when or where they were born. But in every case but one, I didn't read anything about when or where they died, because it isn't there. It just says Holocaust. Those people disappeared. During the early years that Sue and I were married, a conversation would come up once in a while with Sue's grandmother, Carol Bender, we called her Gacka, about what might have happened to those relatives who were caught up in the war. Gacka's answer was always the same: we don't know. What probably happened to most of them is they died at places like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Sobibor, Treblinka, Dachau, or any one of the nearly 1,000 concentration camps that the Nazis had during World War II. So imagine this. You and your family are asleep at night, and suddenly you hear a pounding at the door, so you go down and open the door, and you're confronted by a cadre of Nazi SS soldiers. The SS stood for the Schutzstaffel. These were the most elite units in the German military. They were considered Hitler's personal army. Many of their recruits came from the Hitler Youth. This was an organization that German boys joined around age 8 or 9 and continued on through their teen years. And during that time, they were indoctrinated with the theories of the superiority of the Aryan race. Another fertile ground for recruits were criminals, violent criminals, murderers and rapists. When Hitler came to power in 1933, when he became chancellor, he opened up all the prisons, and many of those criminals were ripe for being recruited into the SS. So you're confronted by this group of SS soldiers at your door, and one of them tells you that you and your family have 15 or 20 minutes to gather up what you can and leave your home and assemble at a designated area in town, like the town square, the local soccer field. So everybody runs around and you grab what you can, a toothbrush, some clothes, a photo album, and you exit your home, and when you get outside, you're met by hundreds or even thousands of other people who have been given the same orders. And the street in front of your house has become a river of humanity, of people, families streaming down to the assembly area. And when you get down there, everybody's just standing around peacefully. There are guards there, but they're not saying or doing anything. And you might be in that limbo for 5 or 6 days. But eventually, you're all marched to the train station or to a railroad siding, and there's a train waiting there. But it's not a passenger train, it's a freight train, and the only cars on the train are cattle cars. And everybody is pushed, shoved into those cattle cars, packed so tightly that about all you can do is just stand like this with your little satchel, with your belongings at your feet. There's no food, there's no water, there's no toilet. If there is a toilet, it's nothing more than a bucket in the corner of the car, but it's so crowded you can't get to it anyway. The train rolls out, and you might be traveling that way for 5 or 6 days. Eventually, the train comes to a stop, and the doors are opened, and you are face to face with dozens and dozens of screaming SS soldiers, and they've got clubs and whips and guard dogs, excuse me, and rifles with bayonets, and they're yelling at everybody to get out of those cars quickly, and if you don't move fast enough, you're clubbed or whipped, or in the worst circumstance, shot on the spot. At this point, the men are separated from the women and children, so families are split up and you're put into lines. And when you get to the front of the line, you're quizzed by an SS soldier on your age and your skills. Are you a carpenter, a bricklayer, a painter, an artist, a school teacher, a doctor, a seamstress? And depending on how you answer those questions, you're told to go left or right into another line. And then you're marched down to a big, long building, and everybody's told to strip naked, even in the dead of winter. And then everybody's herded into the building, and the doors are shut and sealed, and there are shower heads on the ceiling, and everybody's given a cold shower. And then everybody's doused with a disinfectant, and it was often a caustic substance like lye. The reason for that was is that the Nazis were deathly afraid of lice, so they thought that all the prisoners needed to be disinfected. After that, you're issued your prison uniform, which is nothing more than a very thin pajama-type outfit, so thin you can almost see through it, no underwear. And then everybody's marched down to a barracks where you're either assigned a bunk or you might be able to choose it yourself. but it doesn't make any difference because every bunk's already got 5 or 6 or even 7 people in it, and everybody's just crammed in there like that. If you're in the other line, you're marched down to a big building, and everybody's told to strip, and everybody's herded into the building, and the doors are sealed, and there are shower heads on the ceiling, but it's not a shower, it's a gas chamber. There's soldiers up on the roof of the building with canisters of Zyklon B gas. Zyklon B was originally designed as an insecticide, but the Nazis added a little bit of cyanide to it because they figured out that by doing that, they could put hundreds and hundreds or even over 1,000 people in a sealed room, and they could kill them all in about 20 minutes. So that's what they did. Along the peak, the length of the building, there were little receptacles, and the soldiers would take their canisters of Zyklon B and put them in the receptacles, and in the bottom of the receptacle there was a little pin. And when the soldiers slammed down the lid on the receptacle, the pin pierced the bottom of the canister, releasing the gas, and went down through the piping and out the shower head, and in about 20 minutes or so everybody was dead. The gas was then evacuated from the room, and the doors were opened, and then other prisoners, mostly Jews, were forced to go in there and drag out those bodies. And it was just a tangle of arms and legs, torsos. So they'd go in there and they'd pull out those bodies, and they'd put them on wagons or carts or wheelbarrows, whatever was handy, and then they'd wheel them over to the crematoriums where the bodies were going to be burned. But the problem was there were so many bodies, the Nazis couldn't burn them fast enough. So it ended up that there were piles of corpses all over the camp. That's what the Holocaust was all about. If you look up the definition of the Holocaust in an encyclopedia or on Wikipedia, this is how it reads. The systematic, state-sponsored killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators in World War II. The others were gypsies, people of color, mentally and physically handicapped, and anybody else that the Nazis deemed as subhuman. The overriding question all these years has been, why didn't somebody do something to try to stop this? The answer is quite complicated. There are a lot of moving parts to it, but it can basically be broken down into 4 main points. And the first one is, nobody knew. The Nazis planned this in secret and formalized it on January 20th, 1942 at the Wannsee Conference. They called it the Wannsee Conference because it was held in Wannsee, Germany. Wannsee is a suburb of Berlin. This was a secret meeting of the SS High Command, and at that meeting, an SS Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Adolf Eichmann came up with what he called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And the final solution was the total annihilation of the Jews from the face of the earth. The Nazis were very adept at hiding this, and they were able to carry it off until very late in the war. The second point is disbelief. Even when the Allied countries, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, began to hear rumors and get a trickle of intelligence that these killings were taking place, they just didn't believe it. They couldn't conceive that a 20th century industrialized, educated country like Germany would do something like this. A good example of how surprised the Allies were when they found out what was really happening is that on April 12, 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, saw his first concentration camp. On that day, Eisenhower and his entourage rolled into the Ohrdruf concentration camp in central Germany. This was as the Allied forces were moving eastward. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a massive concentration camp, and it had satellite camps all around it. When Eisenhower rolled into Ohrdruf that day and looked around, he saw a few straggly, malnourished, half-dead prisoners. Most of them were lying on the ground. They couldn't stand. And as he looked around, he saw piles of corpses. He was so appalled at what he saw that he told his military photographer, who was accompanying him, to start going around and taking pictures because he wanted the world to see what was happening there. A couple of days later, Eisenhower decided that what he saw was so bad he needed to tell his superior about it, General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff in Washington. And by the way, this is the same George Marshall who became Secretary of State and was the father of the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding of Western Europe after the war. Eisenhower decided to send Marshall a cable, a telegram, describing what he saw. And I'm just going to read what Eisenhower's telegram said. I have visited one of these, he's talking about the camps, myself, and assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date is an understatement. If you would see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders in Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps. I think we can agree from the way Eisenhower worded this that he was surprised at what he saw and didn't realize the extent of it. The third point is limited resources. The Allies, particularly the United States, were fighting a war on two fronts. The Japanese in the Pacific and Germany in the European theater. And the administrations and the military of those countries felt that they just couldn't spare or divert the resources, the machinery, the manpower, the weaponry to do anything about these camps when they really didn't have good intelligence as to what was happening. In some cases, they didn't know exactly where these camps were located. And in other cases, they didn't even know some of these camps existed. The fourth point is isolationism. There were very high-level officials in our government and very influential people outside of our government in private life who felt that the United States shouldn't be involved in the war in the first place, and therefore we didn't need to do anything to help the Jews. The most prominent high-level official in the government with strong isolationist views was Assistant Secretary of State Samuel Breckinridge Long. Before Long was Assistant Secretary, he had been director of the Visa Division at the State Department in Washington. And the Visa Division was responsible for processing and issuing visas to people all over the world who wanted to come to the U.S. When Long was in charge of that office, he instituted a series of very complex regulations that made it almost impossible for refugees, particularly Jewish refugees, to qualify for a visa. In November of 1943, Congress decided to hold hearings on the refugee issue because they were being pressured by humanitarian groups. And they called Long in to testify. And at the hearing, Long testified that when he was head of the visa office, he issued roughly 538,000 visas to refugees, including Jewish refugees, who were trying to get to the U.S. Well, Long vastly overinflated that number by close to 80%. And when Congress figured that out and President Roosevelt heard about it, Long was fired. Two of the most prominent individuals outside of the government with strong isolationist feelings were Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot, and Henry Ford, the head of Ford Motor Company. On September 11th, 1941, less than 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh gave one of his most famous speeches in Des Moines, where he said this: "The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration." Henry Ford at one point owned the Dearborn Independent newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan, where Ford is headquartered. Every week, and by the way, it was a weekly newspaper with a circulation of more than 600,000. And every week, Ford ran an editorial in the newspaper with very derogatory statements about the Jews. Often, those editorials were on the front page with a headline like this one: "The International Jew, the World's Problem." Isolationism has persisted through the years, and recently it's become more prevalent with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. But isolationism has also changed into something more ominous, and that is Holocaust denial. There are groups with harmless sounding names, such as the Institute for Historical Review or the National Alliance, who have tried to convince the public that the Holocaust never even happened, or if it did happen, it wasn't nearly as bad as we've been led to believe. Not that long ago, year 2000, Holocaust denial ended up in court. David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. David Irving is a fairly well-known historian based in London. I think he's still alive. And he had written several books espousing his beliefs as to why the Holocaust was a fake. Deborah Lipstadt is one of the foremost authorities on the Holocaust in our country. She's a professor of history at Emory University, and she's written a number of books in which she dismantles the arguments of the Holocaust deniers. And in one of her books, entitled Denying the Holocaust, which I've read, she specifically takes on David Irving, and he sued her over that. He claimed that when she called him out in her book, she ruined his reputation, the sales of his books tailed off, and he lost money, so he sued her for defamation. The case was filed in London, since that's where he lives, so Deborah Lipstadt hired a London law firm and went over there to defend herself. And she won the case. David Irving didn't get anything. I've been asked, why am I speaking out now about the Holocaust? I don't know how Sue would feel about me getting up here and talking about her family. I hope she would approve, because in a few years, there won't be any survivors or eyewitnesses to talk about what happened. Then it'll be up to the next generation, our generation, my generation, to keep the Holocaust from becoming sanitized, or worse, allowing the deniers to rule the day. There was a little phrase that reverberated around the globe 78 years ago when World War II ended: never again. Through the years, through the decades, the Jewish people have added a couple of words to that. Another phrase: never forget. For the victims of the Holocaust and their descendants, both phrases, all four words, mean a lot more than only the end of the war, because now there are people who want to rewrite history and forget about the 6 million Jews and millions of others who were killed at the hands of the Nazis, including the 17 members of Sue's family in that notebook. If that's where we're headed, where the Holocaust is simply wiped away, what will never again or never forget mean to any of us. Thank you.